Hi, I'm Professor Suneel Maheshwari. I'm a professor with Division of Accounting at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Today we'll be talking about activity-based costing. If you look at the overall cost course, the theme of the course can be divided into three questions. What is cost? How do you measure cost? And how do you manage cost? In terms of how do you measure cost, there are different methods of cost measurement. So one of the methods which we did earlier was job order costing and the process order costing. Today we'll be talking about activity-based costing. Now, the plan for the day is as follows. First, why do we use activity-based costing? Then we will talk about the limitations of the traditional costing. Once we are done with the traditional limitations of traditional costing and have defined why we are going to use activity-based costing, we'll also talk about identification of non-value added activities in a system. We will then talk about what are the indicators for activity-based costing, that is, when you will need activity-based costing, and then go over designing an activity-based costing system and then solve a comprehensive problem with a big view monitor problem. Now, to begin with what activity-based costing is, before I can go on to activity-based costing, let's take a look at a small question. A company has 3 inspectors, each earning a salary of $50,000. One inspector works exclusively on the activity of parts received from the outside supplier. So inspecting parts received from outside supplier, one inspector is there, while the other 2 spend 30% of their time on inspecting parts and 70% of their time on inspecting final product. Also, a total of 1,500 machine hours were used in making the parts. Now the question for you is, how much labor cost out of $50,000 of the salary for each of these inspectors should be assigned to the activity of inspecting parts? Should the cost of parts inspection be allocated based upon time spent or machine hours? You have to think about it because that is a very relevant question in cost accounting. Because if the cost of parts inspection is related to the inspection time, then that is a more relevant cost driver. If the cost of parts inspection is related to the machine hours, then that is a better cost driver. In this case, if you notice, it says that one inspector works exclusively on inspecting parts. That part has nothing to do with the machine hours spent. So if you were to assign cost in this case, it would be more relevant to assign the cost based upon the time spent by the inspector on the activity of inspecting parts rather than the machine hours, because machine hours does not have any relevance in this case to the cost of $50,000. So as far as the first inspection is concerned, inspector is concerned, you've got 100% of the time, which is worth $50,000, is assigned to this part, and then 30% of the second inspector and 30% of the cost for the third inspector is assigned to the cost object. So the total amount assigned in this case for the inspection activity is $80,000. Let's take another activity, which is issuing a purchase order. In any organization, when you need to buy any item, say you want to buy 20 computers for your office, you will fill out a purchase requisition form. This form will be authorized by your supervisor, and then it will be sent to the purchasing department. Once the form is sent to the purchasing department will invite quotations from the suppliers, and they will compare the quotations from the suppliers and come out with the best supplier with whom the order will be placed. And this order will then be placed through making a purchase order. So as far as the purchase department is concerned, all these activities lead to making a purchase order for the organization. Let's take just the costs which are incurred in the purchase department. Say salaries of the purchasing agents, office space rent, stationery, communication expenses, and let's say the total cost incurred is $30,000, excluding of the cost of purchases. Labor hours used in the factory are 20,000, and number of purchase orders made by the purchase department are 10,000. So all those costs of 30,000 basically are incurred in the purchase department, and there are 20,000 labor hours incurred in the factory and 10,000 purchase orders made in the purchase department. Now, would you allocate this cost of purchase department based upon number of purchase orders or labor hours used in the factory? And the question is why? Does the activity of making purchase order consume organizational resources? Now, if you think about the activities in the purchase department, all the tasks that the purchase department undertakes is basically leading to making the purchase order. So if you think about it, then you will come to a logical conclusion that purchase orders is a better basis to allocate the cost of purchase department when compared to the labor hours used in the factory, because the number of purchase orders made in the purchase department are driving the cost in the purchase department. So if you allocate the cost based upon the number of purchase orders made, then the predetermined overhead rate, as we computed in the job order costing as well, will be 30,000 divided by 10,000 number of purchase orders. So in this case, the activity is making a purchase order. Overheads are 30,000, and 10,000 is the number of purchase orders, or which is the level of activity or the basis of allocation of this $30,000. Let's assume that there are two products in this company. One is Crazy and the other is Sleazy. Crazy uses 3,000 purchase orders, so the purchase departments that made 10,000 purchase orders, out of the 10,000, 3,000 related to Crazy and 7,000 related to Sleazy. The cost of making every purchase order was $3, as we computed in the previous slide. And the overhead which will be allocated to the Crazy will be 9,000, which is 3,000 purchase orders times the predetermined overhead rate. So the actual level of activity is 3,000. $3 is the predetermined overhead rate. So 9,000 gets allocated to Crazy from the purchase department cost. Similarly, to the Sleazy, 21,000 gets allocated for $7,000, 7,000 purchase orders, which are relevant to the product, time multiplied by $3 per purchase order, which is the predetermined overhead rate. So what are the differences between the volume-based costing or the traditional costing that we used in, say, process costing or job costing versus the activity-based costing? Activity-based costing kind of uses cause and effect relationship to assign overheads. So in the previous example, the number of purchase orders had certain relationship to the cost incurred in the purchase department. And that makes the overhead allocation more accurate and the estimates more accurate for the total cost of the cost object. Second, activities consume resources. So when you make the purchase order, it is consuming the resources of the organization. And ABC accounts for that consumption more precisely than traditional costing. Volume-based costing cost drivers may not have any relationship to the cost. For example, in the previous example, the labor hours incurred in the factory did not have any relationship to the $30,000 which was spent in the purchase department. So the next question is, what is activity-based costing? Activity-based costing is a two-stage cost allocation method. In the first stage, the costs are allocated to the cost pools. And in the second stage, costs are allocated from the cost pools to the product or the cost object based upon an appropriate cost driver. Please note, identification of an appropriate cost driver is probably one of the most important things which you will do. Because if you identify the cost driver incorrectly, then your cost would be incorrect and your pricing consequently will be incorrect. So to summarize the two-stage cost allocation, you have got the overheads which are allocated to Department A and Department B. All these are related costs. So you've got Department A with related cost or a cost pool with related cost. And then those costs are allocated to the cost object, say based upon direct labor hours. Or there's another department, Department B, which is related cost, say machine time spent, and it is allocated based upon machine hours. Now, direct labor hours, whatever the cost allocation rule or the basis or the activity level you select, it must have some relationship, or it must drive the cost in the cost pool or in that particular Department A and Department B in this particular case. So the objectives of the activity-based costing system: it measures the cost of resources consumed. It identifies and eliminates non-value added cost. And it determines the efficiency and effectiveness of all major activities. If you look at the activity-based costing system, it will basically identify the activity. It will estimate the cost of resources that are consumed for that activities, and in the process will eliminate non-value added activities. Then the next question becomes, what is value added activities and non-value added activities? Because we need to eliminate the non-value added activities to improve the future performance. To give you an example of what is a value-added activity and what is a non-value added activity, let's take a bicycle manufacturer. A bicycle might have more than 150 parts. This bicycle manufacturer gets all the parts from ancillary units or smaller production units outside the factory, assembles these parts into a bicycle, inspects the final product, and then put its own logo on it and let it out for sale. For each of these 150 parts that is received, a particular process is followed in the organization. One of the parts in the bicycle is a pedal. Every bicycle will have a pair of pedals. So I will take you through the process of with this particular company as to what is done when a part or when a pair of pedals are received in the receiving department. So the pair of pedals were ordered through the purchase department. Parts come in the receiving department, they were counted, and then there's a slip of paper on which the receiving clerk would sign that these many parts have been received. Once the parts are counted and accounted for, those parts are inspected by the inspection department. Once the parts are inspected by the inspection departments, parts are sent to stores, and then they are counted for over there again and signed by the store's manager. Once the parts are stored, they might be issued to the production. The production person will come, take the part, count them, and sign for the parts which have been received. Finally, the pair of pedal is put into the bicycle, which basically becomes the final product. It is inspected and then approved and sent for sale. Now, if you think about the above process, which is going through the receiving, inspection, storage, and then the production, what is wrong with the above process? What do you think is not adding any value? The question, if you to be asked is the customer going to pay more if the pedals are counted one more time? Already the pedals have been counted about 3 times. If the pedal is counted one more time, is the customer going to pay more for it? Obviously, the answer is no. Even if you count the pedals 20 more times, the customer is not willing to pay more because you have counted it more times. Then the next question is, are the resources being consumed in counting the pedals? And the answer to this is obviously yes. And since the resources are being consumed, it costs the organization financial money, financial resources. And then the last question to it is, does this activity of counting pedals add any value to the organization? Can we do without counting, basically? If yes, then that is a identification of the non-value added activity over there. In this case, counting the pedals additional number of times is not going to add any value. So that becomes a non-value added activity. Once you have identified a non-value added activity, the process of elimination of non-value added activities need to be undertaken. The question for your thought is, how can we eliminate the counting of the pedals? Now, in an organization, it's not going to happen that someone will come to you and say that we need an activity-based costing system. You'll have to look for the indicators. You'll have to look for the feelers which will point towards the need of having an activity-based costing system. If you look at the direct labor cost, if direct labor is a small percentage of the total cost, then there's no point in using direct labor cost as a basis to allocate the overheads. Similarly, you might have a situation where sales are increasing, but profits are declining. In that case, most likely the selling price is incorrect because of the incorrect estimates of the cost. And the reason for the incorrect estimates of the cost could be that your cost allocation is incorrect. Your cost allocation is incorrect because of the incorrect or non-relevant cost driver or the activity base. Similarly, the marketing department is not using these cost reports for the pricing decision because they do not believe that these reports are correct. Product line profit margins are very hard to explain. Some profits, you will notice that you are bidding for certain contracts and you are winning them again and again. All the 20 other companies are bidding. The most likely scenario might be that you are undercosting the product, and that's why you are basically getting the bids. And again, one of the reasons for undercosting is the incorrect allocation of overheads. Line managers are not believing the product cost reports. And some products that have higher profit margins are not sold by your competitor. That's another indication that you might be selling product at a lower selling price. Next is, how do we develop an activity-based costing system? Here are 4 steps to develop an activity-based costing system. 1, identify the activities that consume resources and then assign cost to them. In the previous example, we had making the purchase order as an activity. Number of purchase orders made was the cost driver for those activities. And then we assigned the cost based upon them. So second step is identify the cost drivers associated with each activity, which was number of purchase orders. Third step, compute a cost rate per cost driver unit or transaction, or also called the predetermined overhead rate. And the last step is to assign the cost to the products by multiplying the cost driver rate by the volume of cost driver units consumed by the product. Now please note that we are going to repeat this process for each activity and for each cost driver associated with it. The process remains same for all of them. We go through the same step. In the traditional costing, we only had one cost driver, so we did this process only once. And in the activity-based costing, since you will have more than one cost drivers, then we'll repeat the process. The question is, the cost drivers are factors that causes or drive an activity's cost. For example, you might have identified activity like setting up machines or handling of material or machining. Packaging and shipping can be another activity. All these cost drivers can be divided based upon a hierarchy, which is based upon volume, batch, product, and so on. Now, if you look at the volume, some of the examples which are related to it are maybe supplies, lubricating oil, machine repair. And the cost driver associated with that cost might be direct labor cost. Lubricating oil could be machine hours and number of units for the machine repair. If you look at the activities related to the batch, these are like setup cost could be one activity, materials handling can be one activity for a batch, and shipping cost for a batch can be a third activity. And in general, you can have setup hours as the related cost drivers for setup cost. Materials handling could have production runs as the activity driver, cost driver, and for shipping cost, number of shipments. Similarly, there are some costs that are related at the product level. So if you can identify the cost at the product level, for example, designing cost, specification cost, then you can use number of products for those costs as the cost driver. Some costs are beyond the product, beyond the batch, and they are incurred at the facility level. For example, general plant cost, plant administration cost, say the CEO's salary or the plant manager's salary. It may not relate to a particular product or a particular batch, but it relates to the plant as a whole. In that case, the direct cost can be used as the direct cost incurred can be used. Now, let's take an example to design an activity-based costing system. Here are certain pieces of information for the two products, J25P and J40X. Number of units is given to you. Once again, you don't have to memorize this information, but just to let you know that the direct labor cost for assembly and packaging will be allocated directly to the product. It can be directly identified with the product, and so can the direct labor cost be. So direct material, direct labor cost, which are the direct cost, is not the focus for this focus of issue for this illustration. What is the focus is the overhead cost that has been incurred. Overhead cost for assembly is $1,620,000 and packaging is $810,000. Now, how do we allocate this cost to J25P and J40X using activity-based costing system? In the assembly department, following activities have been identified: setting up machines, materials handling, and product assembly. So those are the three activities identified. And in the packaging department, the activities identified are packing and shipping. Now we can identify the cost drivers associated with it. Assembling, for example, can be allocated based upon machine hours. Setting up machines can be based upon number of setup hours. Or inspection and packaging can be based upon direct labor hours spent over there, and shipping based upon number of shipment. If you look at the actual level of activity for these two products, that is given to you. So what it tells you is 6,000 hours, machine hours were spent for the activity of assembling for J25P. Similarly, 30,000 hours were spent for the activity of machine hours for assembling. Similarly, if you look at shipping, basically 100 packets were shipped for J25P and 200 were shipped for J40. This brings up another interesting question. How many cost drivers should the organization have? There is no fixed number but a medium-sized company can have 10 to 12 cost drivers, depending upon how cost effective it is to get the information about the cost drivers. Generally speaking, as a rule, whenever you make a cost accounting system, the cost of providing the information should be less than the benefits achieved from that. So if you look at, in this case, we have identified 5 cost drivers for the 2 departments in this company. So the activity is setting up machines, and the cost driver is set up hours. 40 of those are consumed for J25 and 400 for J40, and so on. So the list will come to the step 3 as to how to compute the cost driver rate, or also known as the predetermined overhead rate. So for assembly, $1 million was spent for the activity of assembling. For setting up machine hour, $396,000 was spent. For materials handling, $144,000 was spent, which made up the total of $1,620,000, which we saw earlier as an overall number. Let's start with assembling. In case of assembling, you have got $1,080,000 spent. So the cost of 36,000 machine hours in the assembling activity is basically $1,080,000. So the predetermined overhead rate is $1,080,000 divided by 36,000, giving you $30 per machine hour. Similarly, setting up machine hours is at $900 per setup, and materials handling is for 48 runs, we incurred $144,000, so $3,000 per machine run. So you basically get an idea that this is the same thing which we did in the job costing, same thing we are doing in the process order costing, that is computing the overhead rate. The only thing is we have got more number of cost drivers for activity-based costing, so we can more precisely allocate the cost. Now, in this case, if you look at the materials handling activity, we have got 48 runs, and each run is costing us $3,000. How do you use this information for decision-making purposes? In this case, if for any of the product we can reduce the number of run by 1 or 2, it will save us the cost by $3,000 per run. So we have taken a cost and have shown how variable in nature can it be. So we have shown that the cost, using the activity-based costing, we have shown that the nature can be explained in a different way for the same cost. That is, in this case, $3,000 per run is variable in nature. And if we want to save the cost on runs, we can save $3,000 for every run. Similarly, for machine setups, we are spending about $900 per setup. If we can reduce the number of setup hours, then number of setups for the machine, then we can reduce the cost by $900 for each setup that can be reduced. And that will basically come out of how you're arranging your production schedule. Now, we will allocate the cost. The fourth step is we are assigning the cost using activity-based costing. The activity was assembling. The cost drivers was machine hour. Overhead rate was $30 per machine hour. And the usage or the consumption of activity for J25 was 6,000 hours. And for J40, the consumption was 3,000 machine hours. So 3,000 times 60, 3,000 times 30 gives you 900,000. 6,000 times 30 gives you 130,000 for J25P. Similarly, for machine setup activity, the cost driver was number of setups. It costed $900 per setup. J25P used 40 setups, so 900 times 40 gave you 36,000. On the other hand, J40 consumed 400 setups, and 400 times 900 gave you 360,000. And basically, if you go through each of the allocation, which is given over here in the example, you'll basically come up with the cost that has been allocated overhead cost that has been allocated using activity-based costing for J25 and J40. If you look at the total overhead cost allocated for J25, it is $672,000, and for J40, it is $1,758,000. And this is just the overhead part. Now, if you are to find the total cost of this product, J25 and J40, we need to add the direct material and direct labor associated with it, and then add the applied overheads or the allocated overheads in this case, and that will give you the total cost of producing one J25. If you divide this total cost number by the number of units, then you can get the per unit cost. If you look at the cost flow diagram, in this case, there are two departments, assembling and packaging. And then we had three activities: assembling, setup, and materials handling under assembly. And we had two activities under packaging, that is inspection and shipping. For each of those activities, we basically identified a relevant cost driver. It is important that the cost driver is relevant, and it drives the cost in that particular cost pool. For setups, we have setup hours. For materials handling, we have got number of runs. And once we have done that, then we found the overhead rate and then allocated the cost to each of the products, or also called the cost objects in this case. And the direct cost of direct materials and direct labor are directly assigned to these products. And that basically shows you how you can design an activity-based costing system. If you put it all together, whatever we said up till now, we have got direct material, direct labor, those are the direct costs, and then you added the overhead cost of assembly, and which has three activities. Then you had two activities in packaging. All those costs have been computed earlier. So the total activity-based cost is given to you at $3,912,000 for J25 and $5 million odd for J40. The number of units produced for J25 is 100,000, and number of units produced for J40 is 40,000, giving you a per unit cost of $39.12 for J25. You take $3,912,000 divided by 100,000 to get $39.12. And for J40, you got $5,118,000 divided by 40,000 units, giving you a per unit cost of $127.95. So if you look at the overall activity-based costing system, and if you believe in that this is a more precise estimate, then your unit cost is much better estimate than the traditional costing system. Here is a handout which you can print out in your package from the D2L site. And this gives you the basic information for a company big view monitor. In this case, we have identified 5 activities: parts handling, parts inspection, automated processing, testing, and packaging. And your cost drivers have been identified for the convenience. So parts handling is based upon number of parts, and the total cost incurred for the parts handling activity is $90,000. Similarly, for parts insertion, $990,000 is your total cost, and then for testing, $66,000, and for packaging, another $68,000. And some additional information is given for the three sizes of monitors which are being made by BigView: 20-inch, 17-inch, and 15-inch monitor. Those are the 3 products which are being made. And also, the activities consumed by each of those monitors is basically given to you. Also, when you are looking at orders shipped, please make an assumption that all units produced are sold and shipped to the consumer. Please make that assumption that there is no ending inventory of product left. Number of parts per unit is given to you. Similarly, the machine hour and the labor hours for each of the product is given to you. Now, what I would like you to do is take this problem and try to find the overhead rate and then allocate the cost for overhead cost for a 17-inch monitor, and then also allocate the cost for a 20-inch monitor. Hi, hope you had a chance to look at the problem and try to solve the problem. What I'm going to do now is take you through some of the steps which you might have gone through or which you might not have gone through. Let's start with the first activity, which is parts handling. The basis for allocation in this case is number of parts. The 2000 units have been produced. Each of the unit is taking 30 parts. Similarly, 3000 for 17-inch and then 5000 for 15-inch is taking 20 and 10 parts respectively. If you multiply those numbers, 2,000 by 30, 3,000 by 20, and 5,000 by 10, and add them together, that gives you a total of 170,000 parts. Please be careful that the cost incurred of the cost of 90,000 that has been incurred, it is for handling all 170,000 parts, not for any one particular product line. So next thing is, what is the overhead rate? You have got $90,000 which has been incurred. The denominator is the activity base, which is 170,000 parts. So your cost or cost per part handled is 52.529 or 53 cents approximately. This is your predetermined overhead rate. For the 17-inch monitor, you are using 20 parts. So 20 times 0.529 gives you $10.58 for parts handling. So the interpretation of this is that for a 17-inch monitor, we are consuming $10.58 worth of resources for handling the parts. Next is the activity of parts insertion. The total cost incurred for the parts insertions is $990,000. The total number of parts is 170,000, which we computed earlier. So the overhead rate is $5.82 per part inserted. For a 17-inch monitor, since there are 20 parts, the total cost of parts insertion which will be allocated to the 17-inch monitor is $116.47, which is 20 multiplied by 5.82. The next activity is automated processing. Please note in this case, the basis is different. It is machine hours. So you similarly compute the machine hours, total machine hours for all three monitors, all three kinds of monitors. When you compute that, you will come to the conclusion that the total number of hours spent are 19,000. Follow the same process we did for the number of parts. The total cost of automated processing is $336,000 for 19,000 hours. So every hour of automated processing, we are allocating $17.68. As far as the 17-inch monitor is concerned, 2 hours per 17-inch monitor is being used. So the total number of hours used is 2 multiplied by $17.68, which is the predetermined overhead rate. So $35.36 is allocated for the automated processing activity of 17-inch monitor. For testing, it is, again, you do the same thing. Use the testing hours in this case, and you will find that the total number of hours is 20,000 used for testing. Total cost incurred is 68,000. So the overhead rate is $3.40 per labor hour. And once you do that, the 17-inch monitor uses 2 hours. So 3.4 multiplied by 2 gives you $6.80 for every 17-inch monitor. The next is packaging. This is a little bit different. It is in two steps. First, you know that the total number of orders shipped is 1,500. So you're incurring $45.33 per order. As I told you earlier, to assume that whatever is produced is being shipped, the total number of units, 17-inch units which have been produced, are 3,000. Total number of orders related to 17-inch units are 500. So in every order, 6 units are being shipped. Every order is costing you $45.33 as computed earlier. So you're taking $45.33 divided by 6 units, and that'll give you $7.55 for every 17-inch monitor which has been shipped. So the packaging cost of each of the 17-inch monitor which is being allocated is $7.55. Once you have allocated the activities, once you allocated the cost using the right cost driver, your overhead cost that is allocated to one 17-inch monitor for parts handling is $10.58 that we computed earlier. The parts insertion cost is $116.47. Automated processing overhead is $35.36. And then for testing is $6.80. And packaging is $7.55 per 17-inch monitor. Please note that $176.76 is only the overhead cost allocated for the 17-inch monitor. If you want to compute the total cost of manufacturing a 17-inch monitor, then you need to add the cost of direct material and direct labor to it so that you can come up to the cost of manufacturing a 17-inch monitor. So hopefully this example is explanatory enough that you can do the second part of the problem to find the overhead cost allocated for 20-inch monitor. Today we went over activity-based costing system. We talked about the limitations of traditional costing system and how ABC provides better estimates. And then we went into designing an activity-based costing system and how it will help to identify non-value-added activities and eliminate those non-value-added activities to make the process more efficient. After that, we did 2 problems on activity-based costing system. Hopefully, this takes you to a point where you can design your own activity-based costing system. See you next time. Have a good day.